Welcome, and today we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Michal Schnaider Beeri, the director of the Herbert and Jacqueline Krieger Klein Alzheimer's Research Center at the Rutgers Brain Health Institute. Dr. Beeri is a leading expert in neurology and has spearheaded a groundbreaking study to understand the heightened risk of Alzheimer's disease among South Asian population. So without any further ado, let me welcome Dr. Beeri. Welcome, Dr. Beeri, to ITV Gold. How are you doing?
I'm very well, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a wonderful opportunity for me.
Thank you so much. Pleasure is all ours. So let's start with this. What inspired you to focus on Alzheimer's disease risk, especially among, South Asian population?
Okay. So just shortly, I'll say that Alzheimer's disease is a disease that is typical of older adults, people above the age of 60. People get a little bit confused between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Dementia is an umbrella name for many types of Alzheimer's disease in terms of the clinical course, of the symptoms, of the degradation of memory and other cognitive functions. But the dementia includes different types of diseases that have different pathologies in the brain. And Alzheimer's disease has a certain pattern of pathologies in the brain. And if you take 100 people with dementia, 70% of them will have Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain. And this is why people get confused, okay?
Right.
Because the vast majority of people with dementia have Alzheimer's disease. With the years, we have discovered that, maybe one more number that is important for me to give so people understand the tragic situation we're at in terms of the number of Alzheimer's patients. At this moment, there are about 50 million people with Alzheimer's disease around the world. And if we don't succeed resolving the disease, or at least delaying it dramatically, by 2050, we're anticipating about 150 million people with Alzheimer's disease. And the reason is that it's a disease of aging, and the frequency, the prevalence of the disease increases as you become older. If at the age of 65 to 70, about 3 to 5% of the people will have Alzheimer's disease. At the age of 85, it's about half.
Wow.
All right? Now, with time, we have discovered that it's a disease, that it's likely many diseases. And one of the things that differentiates the course of the disease is the origins of the community, the race, the ethnicity, the culture that the person comes from. So, for example, African Americans, they have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than whites, and people from East Asia actually have a low risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. What strikes me the most, and this was possibly the main reason why I decided to establish the Alzheimer's Research Center and our what we call the Samina cohort, which is South Asian and Middle Eastern North African, so it's Samina cohort, is that the South Asians are more numerous than the Chinese by now, right? It's half the population of the world, and we know so little. We know almost nothing about the risk factors, the protective factors, the course of disease, the reaction to medications, the genetics. We know almost nothing. So our goal is actually to sincerely, truly, and with all our energy and intellectual might to make a difference for Alzheimer's disease in general and for the South Asian population in particular, as we know that there might be significant differences that if we don't learn them ahead of time, we're not going to be able to help.
But why, my question is, why is South Asians at such a high risk?
Okay, so we don't know if South Asians are at particularly high risk.
Okay.
We do know that South Asians, especially the Indian community, are the population with the highest risk for diabetes. Okay, so almost 50% of people above the age of 50 among the Indian community in particular, they have type 2 diabetes, which is an enormous amount of diabetics. And our research has focused quite a bit on diabetes and on obesity. And we have shown that people with diabetes have 2 to 3 times higher risk of developing dementia compared to people without diabetes. And that made us think, if there is such a high prevalence of diabetes among the South Asian community, that means they are at enhanced or at heightened risk of developing dementia and Alzheimer's.
So basically you are saying it's, if a person has diabetes, if a person is obese, they have more chances. How about, if a person has depression?
That's a very important question, okay? It's a very important. Depression is a very complicated risk factor for dementia. The reason is that when we look at a risk factor, we want to define, okay, so what is depression? What characterizes depression? And if a person has that, will that person 10 years from now, 15 years from now, have a higher risk of developing dementia? The problem is that depression is tricky. First of all, depression is part of the disease. Okay, so many times when cognitive decline begins, memory impairment begins, there is depression accompanying that memory problem. And this is why for the doctors, differentiating old age dementia from old age depression sometimes is very difficult. Another reason why this becomes complicated is that people who are depressed, they are at high risk of not doing what they need to do with their health. Okay, right. So they'll eat more, and they'll eat more the things that they shouldn't be eating, and they'll tend to withdraw, and they'll be less exposed to the day-to-day activities. So there are many things that would contribute to someone depressed to have less exposure to life, and therefore a heightened risk of dementia.
Wonderful. So, let's talk about your, study,
yes.
What you are doing about Alzheimer's. Yes. So let's talk a little bit some of the key factors, what you are looking when you are, trying to research this.
Okay. So this is also an important question because the bottom line is what I said in the beginning of our conversation. We know almost nothing.
Right.
And therefore, we're going to examine every possible risk factor that could contribute to dementia in the South Asian community. So first of all, we're going to measure cognition because we want to follow people over time and see if their cognition is declining. We're also going to do MRI of the brain because we want to see if there are biological changes that are happening in the brain. Those are what we call the outcome measures. The predictors, the risk factors, and the protective factors, right? It's very comfortable always to say this is bad for your health and this is bad for your health. But there are certain things that are very good for your health, and if you enhance them, then you're actually decreasing your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So we're looking at both sides of the coin. We're going to look at social determinants of health, physical activity, diet, cognitive activity, social activity, genetics, everything that we sleep. This, by the way, I don't know if the people can see, this is called an actigraph, and I'm wearing it because I want to see how it looks on me, and we're going to put those on people. Those measure every single movement.
So this is for example, I have the Apple Watch where it can measure my mostly I use it for my steps that I gotta get my 10,000 steps a day. But what does this do?
So the actigraph is specific to movement, and here you get your steps, right? You get your heart rate a little bit,
I see. You have one side that also.
Yes. Now this one is my regular, and this one I just put because I want to feel what our participants are going to feel. So I've been with this for a week. So it measures every single movement that we do. I shower with it.
Wow.
And it also measures the architecture of your sleep. So we get both sleep and movement in a very, very granular level. Remember that sometimes people who are older adults, they can't go running 10 miles, right? But it's enough that they're doing a lot in their home, and they're doing dishes, and they're washing their clothes, and they're going out with their grandchild, and this will be counting that. Well, if they have to report just on physical activity, they might be saying, no, I don't do physical activity. Well, there is quite enough movement. The focus that we're going to have is on offspring of Alzheimer's patients, okay? I'll explain why in a moment, but we're looking for people who are between the ages of 40 and 70, 45 and 70, okay? So those are ages where the pathology in the brain begins aggregating, begins building up, but typically people don't have symptoms yet. We want to catch people at that stage and learn the course of their cognition over time, their trajectories. And the reason why I want to focus on people who have a parental family history of Alzheimer's disease, meaning a mom or dad who had it, or both, which you also get, unfortunately, is because offspring of Alzheimer's patients are at significantly increased risk of developing the disease, and we feel it's going to give us a chance to investigate the people that our possibility of giving quickly something back as soon as clinical trials and changes and treatments evolve is going to be optimal.
Wonderful. So let's talk more about like the genetic factors.
Yes.
So how can you tell, more about that this person is, going to be having Alzheimer's, while as this is not? How do you do all that?
Okay. So I'm going to divide it into two separate pieces, okay? There are mutations, especially 3 mutations that have been very well characterized. And I don't know if you have watched Still Alice, the movie, but in that movie she has a mutation, and that mutation causes the disease. You have it, you will have Alzheimer's disease. It's called early onset Alzheimer's disease. As in the movie, she was 50 when she started developing symptoms.
So sorry to interrupt you, but does this disease start 20, 30 years before a patient comes to know that he or she has Alzheimer's?
That is absolutely correct, and this is the reason why we want the offspring in relatively young ages, 45 to 70, because this is when the pathology starts aggregating. So we have people that we know, because we measure it, they have pathology at the age of 48 and 50, no symptoms whatsoever, but we want to follow and characterize them very well and be ready at the very first moment to address it, to suggest treatment, etc., and also to understand what is that we need to do to change that course to something that doesn't continue declining. So as I said, that there are the mutations, and the mutations cause the disease, and they're maybe 1 to 2% of the Alzheimer's patients have the mutations, and those people are typically very young, 30, 40, 50 years old. The vast majority of Alzheimer's disease patients, 98% or so, they begin with symptoms after the age of 60, and as I mentioned before, the older you are, the higher the risk. The genetics are complex, and what does that mean? If your first degree family member developed the disease early, let's say at his or her 60s, your risk is higher for developing the disease than if your first degree family member developed the disease at the age of 85. And in fact, we have data that shows that if a person developed Alzheimer's disease after the age of 90, then all first degree family members have a random chance. Then that doesn't have genetics anymore on that person, okay? There is one gene called the ApoE gene, which we don't know what's its effect on the South Asian population, all right? So people who carry the ApoE4 type of the gene are at increased risk, okay? So the actor that plays Thor discovered that he has 2 ApoE4s, one from mom, one from dad, because he did the genetic testing, 23andMe or whatever the name of that, and he discovered he's positive from both mom and dad. That means that he's highly, highly likely to develop the disease, highly likely, and he's making a change in his life, right, in his priorities because of that. That's the most well-studied and consistent gene that increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. By the way, there are 3 types of that gene, 2, 3, and 4. And the people who have the 2 seem to be protected. They just happen to be a very small portion of the population. I can tell you that among the Black people, the ApoE4 has a lower effect, deleterious effect, as much as it has in white people. We know nothing about the South Asian population. All right. At this point, there are about 100 additional genes that have small effects on the disease, but have been implicated in the disease in big genetic studies. And part of what we have been doing as a field is developing something called PRS, polygenic risk score, which essentially measures in your blood all your genes, and makes kind of a summary of all those genes. And theoretically, if you have a high load of the genes that are associated or related to high risk of Alzheimer's disease, then you're likely to be at higher risk.
So, let's talk about your research. I want to know, how can, this research lead to, better treatment?
Sure.
And especially, even early diagnostics.
Okay. So, think of it in, again, everything I'm dividing today in two pathways, right? So one is the diagnostics, as you said, and one is the treatment, okay? In the diagnostics, we are using novel measurements, for example, this, but also we're going to do some cognitive testing on a weekly basis, because when you test people face to face, it's that particular moment, and we're going to be seeing people every 2 years, but then we're going to have something in the phone. So once in a while they do a simple test and we get a sense of what's happening to their cognition more smoothly over time in order to understand the course or the trajectory of cognition of that person. Those, we're going to do speech analyses, right? Think about it, that our speech comes from our brain. And as we age, we're a little slower in how we speak. We do a little bit more of We have a harder time bringing the right word out, right? Yeah, it takes a little longer to get what the other person said if it's a little more sophisticated. All those things we can measure today with very sophisticated machine learning algorithms that we're doing. And in that way, hopefully, we're going to be able to be sensitive to the very, very first signs of disease. So this is on the diagnostic side. On the treatment side, there are two pathways, all right? One is the treatments that are already available have been approved. There is a set of treatments that are called cholinesterase inhibitors. Those are the old school treatments. They're taken as pills. And what they do is increase a certain chemical in the brain named acetylcholine. And this chemical, this neurotransmitter, is low in the brains of Alzheimer's. It increases the level of this chemical in the brain. In 30 to 40% of the patients, it helps, but it helps in a very limited way and only for a period of time. So think of it a little bit like a Tylenol, just a longer-term Tylenol. So if a person is planned, or that person's brain is going to have that person decline in this rhythm, that cholinesterase inhibitor will give you a blip. You're going to do a little better for some time, but eventually you're going to go back to where you would have been if you haven't taken it. Now there are the new medications, okay? They're called aducanumab, lecanemab, donanemab. MAB means monoclonal antibodies. Wow. Those are little, let's say, chemicals or biological substrates that cling and shine cling and break down one of the main pathologies of Alzheimer's disease, which is named amyloid. It's a protein that aggregates in between brain cells, okay, in between neurons. So that protein aggregates here and eventually causes the death of the cells. And those medications, those monoclonal antibodies for amyloid, they break the amyloid and take it out. Recently, the FDA approved lecanemab, and it's an infusion treatment. And for early Alzheimer's disease, people have to show that they have, people need to have that pathology in the brain, so not everyone can be treated with that. And more recently, another medication named donanemab was also approved. Those medications seem to have a small but consistent effect. And remember, I told you the old school medications, they blip you up a little bit in your memory, and then eventually you went back down. In contrast to the new ones, that if your course was planned to be this way, it's now going to be this way. What we don't know yet, those studies, they're 18-month studies. We don't know yet what happens after 5 years. Right. But if this trend continues, then theoretically, you're taking someone that in a period of 5 years is not going to be recognizing if you don't treat. And theoretically, because we don't know yet, if you treat, that person will continue declining, but in a much slower pace, and you might gain the life of that person for a longer period of time. I want to mention something. You ask, what are we doing that will increase our chances of doing good treatments? As I mentioned before, we are interested in people with metabolic derangements, okay, with people with high risk of diabetes, obesity, etc. Those people are less likely to be receiving those new medications, okay? Because part of the side effects of those new medications is microbleeds. It's like tiny little bleeds in the brain. People with metabolic derangements will tend to have some disease in the brain vessels. So they're at high risk of developing severe side effects of those new medications. As a side note, the clinical trials, the big trials that were done on those medications, 80% of the participants, or so, depending on the study, were not eligible.
No.
So what we want to do is to target them.
Right.
Okay?
So that was my question, like what can someone do if they are interested in this kind of a research and they want to be a part of it?
So we're going to provide an email, and what we're doing now is we're screening many people, seeing if they're eligible for our studies. So being from South Asian origin is an eligibility criterion, and having a parent that had Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia is also an eligibility criterion. As I mentioned before, between the ages of 45 to 70, and I can, maybe I'll speak to the camera and I'll say, please come and participate, because through you, we're going to be able to learn a lot about how this community is developing or not developing Alzheimer's disease, and do something specific to the community to help.
And doctor, so one question that's coming to my mind is that how is the research going to be and how is it going to compensate?
Okay, so we're going to have every 2 years, either 2 or 3 visits. It depends on how much time and how much patient the participant has. We're going to have people be tested for cognition, which is our primary outcome. We're going to ask several questionnaires about the different things that I mentioned before that we're going to be assessing, such as social determinants of health, etc. We're going to invite the participant to have a brain MRI, because we want to see if the biology of the brain is doing well. And people are going to be compensated up to $175 for that set of assessments.
That's really, I mean, good, and especially for the people who really have like seen in their families.
Yeah.
People, you know, having Alzheimer's and stuff like that.
People know the suffering.
Yes.
People know the pain.
So, you know, before I say thank you to you, I want you to talk more about the lifestyle changes, because us, you know, especially all of us, it doesn't matter whether we are from, you know, South Asian or anybody, these days the kind of food we eat, I feel it has a lot to do with the kind of things like our sicknesses and stuff like that too. So I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So I'm going to say first the following. Okay, there are 7 big risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. There are a bunch of others, but 7 big risk factors. Okay, some of them we have spoken about, which is diabetes, obesity, hypertension, smoking, and lack of physical activity. Okay, couch potato. Those 5 are risk factors for the heart as well. They are risk factors for the heart as well. There are 2 risk factors, one of them you have mentioned as well, that are specific to the brain. One of them is depression, and the other one, as couch potato of the mind, is not being mentally active. Okay?
Yes.
The reason why we don't put nutrition in this bag, it's because I say it's more complicated than genetics. What you get into your mouth is a function of your education, of what your parents cooked at home, of how close you're to a McDonald's, of how enjoyable you feel a salad is in contrast to a sundae, and your adolescence, if you're more overweight or less overweight, and more liked or disliked because of social, let's say, influences on how you look or don't look, making diet, possibly in my opinion, the most complicated topic in its contribution to dementia. All that said, there have been several. In the beginning, people will study specific nutrients, right? So vitamin E, vitamin D, certain things that we know the brain really needs, and if you have a deficiency, then maybe when you complement for the deficiency, it's going to do a good job. And nothing much came out of those trials. The reason is, or one of the reasons is, that we don't eat vitamin E, and we don't eat vitamin D or B or whatever. We eat a meal that has everything, right?
Exactly.
So then the literature, the field moved into looking at eating patterns. And one eating pattern that has been showing consistently in different studies as decreasing the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and slowing the rate of cognitive decline is the Mediterranean diet. Okay, so Mediterranean diet is primarily fruits, vegetables, fish and nuts. Those are the big ones.
Where you have omega-3s, I guess.
And a lot of olive oil.
Yes.
A lot of, we have data showing that really olive oil is what brings most of it into.
But recently, you know, people have been, you're talking about oil, people have been saying avocado is the best. I feel like every year it kind of changes. One time it's avocado, one time it's olive, one time it's some other oil. So
this is why I'm persisting on the Mediterranean diet. Okay, so I'm not saying it's this or this or this. I'm saying that if your general diet is primarily based, so you're going to have your cake and you're going to have your whatever, your Coke. But if in general your diet is based on fruits, vegetables, fish, and nuts, then you are doing something good for your body in general, for your longevity in general, and definitely for your brain.
Wonderful. I think really I learned a lot from you
wonderful.
today, and it's like really wonderful to know that you are researching and trying to do your part for the community.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about it. I feel I have to dedicate myself to this because it's a whole community, an enormous community that we know so little about.
Wonderful, and thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Thank you.